Hi, this is Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm casting on a pair of Switchback socks, and I'd like to share 5 quick tips for neatly casting on in the round. These tips will help you when you're starting larger projects like hats or even sweaters that are worked in the round on circular needles, or small circumference projects like mittens, gloves, and socks using DPNs, a set of long circular needles for the magic loop method, or even 2 circular needles. Since it's a little bit more compact and easier to see on video, I'll be demonstrating primarily on DPNs. Tip number 1. After you cast on your stitches, don't turn your work. Whenever you're working in the round, the first stitch you knit will be the first stitch you cast on, unless your pattern specifically says otherwise. This prevents a large stair step or jog at the cast on edge. So for my example, this is the first stitch I cast on, and then I worked around. So this is going to be the first stitch that I knit in the round. Tip number 2. Before knitting that first stitch, make sure that your work isn't twisted. It can be helpful to set your needles flat on a table. Then check that the edge of the cast on stitches makes a nice loop here at the center of your needles. If you started knitting and the edge of your cast on stitches was actually looped over a needle and it looked something like that, you would be able to start knitting and eventually correct the twist by kind of repositioning your needles. But unfortunately, that causes a very noticeable uneven stitch right along the edge of your cast on. And just for example purposes, let's look here at how it looks on Magic Loop also, because it's a little bit different. So if you cast on using Magic Loop, this is the first stitch cast on, and then I worked around. Again, you want to check and make sure that edge of the cast on is here at the center of the needles, and then this would be the first stitch that's knit. Nothing is twisted over the top of a needle. Tip number 3. If you just start working the first round, you'll end up with a slight gap between the last and the first cast on stitches. The fastest way to close that gap is to actually work the first few stitches of the round with both the working yarn and the yarn tail. And at home you would probably be doing this if you were using DPNs. You would probably use a 5th DPN. Again, for demonstration purposes, so there's not so many needles in the way, I'm just doing this and continuing on with just 4 DPNs. So after you knit that first stitch, you pull it kind of snug to close up any gap, and then work a couple more stitches with both strands of yarn. And then you would continue on with just your working yarn and drop the yarn tail. The downside to doing this method is that if you look really closely here, see if I can get it to focus, you can still see the knot from the slip knot of your first cast on stitch. And also you get just a little bit of bulk here in these first couple stitches because they're worked with 2 strands of yarn. Tip number 4. A better way to close the gap between the last and the first cast on stitches is actually to reverse their order on your needles. So you slip the first cast on stitch onto a DPN, or you could use a cable needle if you wanted to, and hold it at the front of your work. Then you're going to slip the last cast on stitch onto the first needle. And just be careful, it widens up there as you're moving it because the working yarn can tighten it or loosen it. So you might want to tighten it so you don't lose it. And then return that held stitch and put it onto your right needle. And tighten everything up by pulling on the working yarn. And then you would go ahead and knit the first few stitches, or purl, depending on what your pattern says. And again, the plus side of doing it this way is that you don't have that bulk that you did by knitting the first few stitches with 2 strands of yarn. The downside is, if you look close, again, you can still see that slip knot from the first cast on stitch. Tip number 5. The neatest way to close the gap between the last and the first cast on stitches of the round is actually to cast on one more stitch than your pattern calls for. Then you're going to slip that first cast on stitch over onto your right needle, and then pass that extra cast on stitch up and over the first cast on stitch. And it's like you're binding off a stitch right away at the beginning. And then you can return the first cast on stitch back to your left needle. Then when you pull on your working yarn, and sometimes depending on your cast on method, you may need to also pull on the yarn tail. But when you pull the working yarn and the yarn tail, what happens is that slip knot at the beginning actually gets covered up by the working yarn. So then you can continue knitting in the round, starting with that first cast on stitch, and my yarn split there a little bit, and then your slip knot is concealed, and also you don't have the extra bulk at the first few stitches because you're only working with a single strand of yarn. I hope you enjoyed my 5 tips for casting on in the round. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. And if you have any tips of your own, please share them in the comments below. Until next time, happy knitting!